Last August, I cleared the mosquitoes out of my backyard for less than $10 in materials and about an hour of work. We sat outside that whole evening. No slapping, no buzzing in our ears, no welts on the kids' arms the next morning. It actually felt strange at first, like something was missing, because we had gotten so used to fighting them every night. Meanwhile, my neighbor down the street paid a mosquito service close to $400 for the season. They come out every 3 weeks, spray a chemical fog across his yard, and by the third day after each treatment, his wife is back inside complaining about getting bit again. Same neighborhood, same drainage ditch behind the houses, completely different results. That difference didn't come from money, and it didn't come from stronger chemicals either. Because here's the thing, I didn't spray anything. No fage, no zapper, no propane, no electric device at all. Nothing like that. What I did instead was target something most people never even think about when they fight mosquitoes. I went after the part of their life cycle that actually keeps the whole population going. And I let one simple biological tool do most of the work for me. Today I'm going to walk you through exactly how that system works, step by step. And at the end, I'll also show you a small bonus trick I built from a basic 2-liter bottle that works surprisingly well near doors, patios, and screen porches. But before any of that, you need to understand why almost everything people normally try doesn't actually solve the problem. Because I've tried all of it too. For nearly 20 years, I fought mosquitoes the same way most homeowners do. I bought a bug zapper, the big blue light kind hanging in the tree out back. Every time I heard that loud pop at night, I thought I was winning. It felt satisfying. But later I found out something that completely changed how I see those devices. Research from the University of Delaware showed those zappers mostly kill moths and harmless insects. The mosquitoes barely get touched. So I wasn't solving anything. I was just killing the wrong bugs. Then I moved on to citronella candles. I'd line them around the deck like some kind of protective barrier. It didn't work. Then citronella torches. Same result, just more smoke and irritation. After that, I spent nearly $300 on a propane mosquito trap that claimed it could protect an entire yard. I placed it near the seating area, thinking it would create a safe zone. But I still got eaten alive, sitting just a few feet away from it. Then came the chemical phase. I started spraying permethrin around the yard every couple of weeks. Shrubs, grass, edges of the fence, everything. And yes, it worked for about 4 or 5 days. Then rain came, washed it down, and the mosquitoes came right back. Except now, I had chemicals spread across plants where bees were supposed to feed. That's when something clicked. I was talking to a county mosquito control technician one summer at a fishing access point. He was checking a culvert for larvae using a small dipper. We started talking, and I asked him a simple question: what actually works at a homeowner level? He didn't hesitate. He said something I've never forgotten. You can't kill your way out of a mosquito problem one bug at a time. He explained that every female mosquito can lay hundreds of eggs at once. And under the right conditions, those eggs become biting adults in less than a week. So even if you kill thousands of adults, you're just replacing them with the next wave already developing nearby. Then he said the sentence that changed everything for me: the only way to win is to go where they're born. That shifted my entire thinking. Because suddenly the problem wasn't about mosquitoes flying around the yard. It was about where they were coming from in the first place. And once you understand that, the whole strategy changes. Here's the core idea this entire system is built on. Adults are the symptom. Water is the cause. Every mosquito you see biting you at night didn't come from somewhere far away. It likely came from a tiny bit of standing water within just a short walking distance of your home. Not a pond, not a lake, something much smaller than people expect. A bottle cap of water is enough. That means if you keep targeting adult mosquitoes, you're always reacting too late. But if you remove the water sources where they develop, the entire population collapses naturally within a couple of weeks. Because that's their life cycle. It's fast, and it's dependent on water. So the first real step is not spraying anything. It's not buying anything either. It's observation. You have to see your yard differently. Not as grass and trees and furniture, but as potential water collection points. Every shaded corner, every container, every object that can hold even a teaspoon of water becomes important. And once you start looking at it that way, you realize the problem has been sitting in plain sight the whole time. Now you move into the part that actually exposes where mosquitoes are really coming from in most yards. And it usually surprises people because it's not the swamp or the ditch down the road. It's the small, ignored things sitting right outside the door. The first real step in the system is what I call a full property audit. This is not complicated, but it's where most people fail because they underestimate how little water mosquitoes actually need. You take a phone or notebook and slowly walk your entire yard. And I mean slowly. Not just looking at wet areas, but actively scanning for anything that can hold water, even temporarily. Because mosquitoes don't need a pond. Some species can complete their entire early life cycle in water as small as a bottle cap. So you start noticing things you normally ignore. The saucer under a plant pot that always collects a little rain. The bird bath you filled 2 weeks ago and forgot about. The corner of a tarp covering outdoor equipment that folds just enough to trap water. The upside-down lid of a plastic container in the yard. The dog bowl that hasn't been changed in a few days. The wheelbarrow sitting slightly tilted, holding a shallow pool of rainwater. Even gutters matter more than people think, especially if they're clogged with leaves and forming slow-draining pockets. Then there are hidden ones. Tree hollows where a branch broke off and left a cavity. Old tires stacked behind sheds. Drainage extensions that sag in the middle. The bottom of recycling bins that never fully dry. Each one of these looks harmless individually, but together they can produce thousands of mosquitoes in a short time. This is why professional mosquito control agencies emphasize weekly inspection. Because the mosquito life cycle is fast enough that standing water left for just a few days can become a breeding cycle. So the goal of this step is simple. Find everything that holds water, no matter how small. Once you see your yard this way, you realize something important. Mosquito control is not about spraying more. It's about removing opportunity. After the audit comes the second step, drain and cover. This is where you physically eliminate breeding sites whenever possible. If something can hold water and you don't need it, you dump it, flip it, empty it, or throw it out entirely. But there's an important detail most people miss here. Just dumping water is not enough. Mosquito eggs are surprisingly resilient. Some can stick to the inside walls of containers and survive even when the water is gone. Then the next rain fills it again and the cycle restarts instantly. That's why scrubbing matters. A quick brush inside containers breaks that cycle completely. Now for things you cannot remove or empty, you shift to covering. Rain barrels are a good example. If you use them for gardening, you can't just dump them. So you cover them with fine mesh screen, small enough that mosquitoes physically cannot pass through. Not hardware cloth. The openings are too large. It has to be fine mesh. Same idea applies to overflow pipes, water storage systems, and anything designed to hold rainwater intentionally. Then there are often forgotten structures like septic vents or plumbing vents sticking out of the ground or roof lines. If those are open, mosquitoes can actually enter and find water inside the system. That's why simple mesh caps are used. Cheap, but extremely effective. Next are tree holes. These are one of the most underestimated breeding spots. A broken branch can leave a hollow cavity that slowly fills with rainwater. You can't pour it out. So you either fill it with material like sand or foam, or seal it depending on the tree condition. At this stage, something important starts to happen. You begin removing all the accidental water sources. But even after doing that carefully, you will still have a few areas you can't fully control. That's where the system moves into the next layer. Because no matter how careful you are, there are always places like drainage ditches, low ground areas, or neighboring properties that still hold water. And that's where biological control becomes essential. This is where the system stops being manual cleaning and starts becoming strategic control. Because instead of trying to constantly chase mosquitoes, you start breaking their reproduction cycle itself. And that's exactly where the next step begins. Now we get into the part of the system where most people finally start seeing real, noticeable results. Because this is where you stop trying to control mosquitoes one by one and instead start breaking their entire population cycle. Even if you've cleaned your yard perfectly, there will still be water you cannot fully remove. This is normal. You're not trying to create a zero water world. That's impossible. What you're trying to do is stop that water from producing mosquitoes. And that's where BTI comes in. BTI stands for Bacillus thuringiensis israelensis. It sounds complicated, but the idea behind it is actually very simple. It's a naturally occurring soil bacterium that produces proteins toxic only to mosquito larvae and a few closely related insects. That's it. It doesn't affect fish. It doesn't harm pets. It doesn't damage plants. It doesn't target humans, birds, or beneficial insects like bees or butterflies. It only works when mosquito larvae eat it. So instead of trying to kill flying mosquitoes in the air, you target them at the only stage where they are trapped, in water. This is where products like mosquito dunks come in. They contain BTI in a slow-release form. You drop one into standing water, and it gradually spreads the bacteria across the surface. When mosquito eggs hatch, the larvae start feeding on the water particles. And within a short time, their digestive system breaks down the BTI toxins, which destroys them from the inside. They never get a chance to become biting adults. The important thing to understand here is scale. A single female mosquito can lay hundreds of eggs in one batch, and she can repeat that multiple times in her short life. Now, multiply that by every breeding site in a neighborhood. A small, unnoticed water source can easily produce thousands of mosquitoes over a few weeks. So when people rely only on sprays or traps, they're always fighting the end result. But when you use BTI, you're interrupting the production line itself. That's the real shift. Not killing mosquitoes faster, but preventing them from ever reaching adulthood. And once you understand that, the strategy becomes very straightforward. You treat every water source you cannot remove. Rain barrels, drainage areas, garden water features, low-lying flood spots, even old containers that occasionally fill with rainwater. Each one becomes neutralized, not by removing the water, but by making the water biologically unsafe for mosquito development. And because BTI is self-limiting and breaks down over time, you do have to reapply it periodically, usually once every few weeks, depending on rainfall and temperature. But compared to constant spraying, it's extremely low maintenance. Now, once the breeding cycle is under control, the next issue becomes adult mosquitoes already in your yard. Because even if you stop new ones from being born, the existing population will still be active for a short period. This is where yard environment plays a big role. Mosquitoes don't just fly randomly in open air. They spend most of their time resting in shaded, humid, protected areas. This is called harborage. And if your yard has a lot of dense, damp vegetation, you're basically giving them shelter during the hottest parts of the day. So the goal here is airflow and sunlight. You start trimming back dense shrubs, especially those close to walls or seating areas. You open up the base of bushes so air can move through instead of trapping moisture. You remove thick leaf piles under decks or in corners where humidity stays high. Even grass height matters more than people realize. Taller grass creates cooler, shaded zones where mosquitoes can rest comfortably. Shorter, well-maintained grass reduces that resting space significantly. And something people rarely expect. Ivy or thick wall vegetation can become one of the best mosquito shelters in a yard. When you remove it, you often notice a sudden drop in activity around that area because you've eliminated one of their daytime hiding spots. At this point, you're attacking mosquitoes from two directions. You're stopping new ones from being born, and you're removing the environment that allows adults to survive comfortably. But there's still one more layer that makes a huge difference in real-world comfort. Because even a reduced mosquito population can still be annoying when you're sitting outside. And this is where airflow becomes a surprisingly powerful tool. A simple box fan placed near a seating area can completely change the situation. Mosquitoes are weak flyers. They struggle against steady airflow. When a fan is running, it creates a moving air barrier that makes it physically difficult for them to land. At the same time, it disperses the carbon dioxide you naturally exhale, which is what mosquitoes use to locate humans from a distance. So instead of following a concentrated scent trail, They lose direction before they get close enough to bite. This combination, air movement and CO2 dispersion, creates a zone that is extremely uncomfortable for them to navigate. And unlike chemical sprays or repellents, this method doesn't rely on toxins or repeated applications. It's just physics. Now, when you combine all three layers together, something important happens. The mosquito population doesn't just decrease, it collapses. Because you've removed breeding sites, you've treated remaining water with BTI, and you've reduced adult survival and activity in your yard environment. At this stage, mosquitoes are no longer controlling your yard experience. They become occasional, isolated insects instead of a constant presence. And that's the real goal of this system. Not elimination of every mosquito in the world, but breaking the cycle so your yard becomes usable again. Once you understand this structure, everything else in mosquito control starts to make sense. Sprays become secondary. Traps become optional. And frustration gets replaced with a predictable system that actually works long-term. Now that the breeding cycle is under control and the yard environment is no longer favoring mosquitoes, the system shifts into something most people completely overlook, actively managing the remaining adult population in a way that doesn't rely on chemicals or constant effort. Because even when you do everything right, you'll still occasionally have mosquitoes showing up. The difference is they're no longer being continuously produced in large numbers. Now you're dealing with leftovers, stragglers, and occasional imports from nearby properties. And that changes the strategy completely. At this stage, the goal is not elimination. It's suppression and disruption. One of the most effective tools for this is something extremely simple. A strategically placed CO2-based attract and trap system. Mosquitoes locate humans primarily by detecting carbon dioxide in the air. Every breath you exhale creates a detectable trail. In still air, that trail can travel farther than most people realize. So instead of trying to hide completely, you can redirect that behavior. A basic yeast and sugar setup can generate a steady stream of CO2 that mimics human breath. When placed correctly, it acts like a decoy signal. Mosquitoes follow the scent trail toward what they believe is a host, but instead of finding a person, they encounter a trap zone. This doesn't eliminate the entire population, but it reduces the number reaching you directly, especially in small outdoor areas like porches or seating corners. But this method works best only when the surrounding environment is already controlled, which is why timing matters. If you try to use traps without removing breeding sites first, you're essentially trying to empty a bathtub while the faucet is still running. That's why this step comes later in the system. Now, there's another factor that makes a massive difference in real-world results. Understanding how mosquitoes actually behave during the day. Most people think mosquitoes are constantly flying around aggressively. But in reality, they spend a large portion of their time resting. They don't like direct sunlight. They don't like wind. They prefer still, shaded, humid microenvironments. This means your yard can either feel like a hostile zone or a protected resting area, depending on how it's structured. That's where harborage management becomes critical. Harborage is just a technical term for places mosquitoes hide and rest. And most residential yards are full of it without the owner realizing. Dense shrubs close to the ground. Overgrown hedges that trap moisture inside. Piles of leaves under decks. Shaded corners where air never moves. Tall grass that stays cool even during hot weather. Each of these acts like a daytime shelter. So when mosquitoes survive the night, they don't just disappear. They retreat into these protected zones, wait, and then re-emerge in the evening. If you remove those zones, you remove their ability to comfortably persist in your yard. This is why trimming vegetation is not just aesthetic, it's functional pest control. Opening airflow through shrubs reduces humidity buildup. Reducing ground clutter exposes resting insects to heat and air movement. Even small changes in structure can significantly reduce how livable a yard feels to mosquitoes. Another often ignored factor is edge zones. Mosquitoes rarely stay in open sunlight or fully exposed areas. They concentrate along transitions, edges where shade meets open space, or where vegetation meets structures. That's why patios near dense hedges often feel worse than open lawns. So when improving a yard, focusing on edge management is more effective than random trimming. You're essentially removing their preferred, safe corridors. Now, once these environmental changes are in place, you can start thinking about reinforcing the system. This is where layering becomes powerful. Each method alone has limited effect, but together, they create compounding pressure. Water elimination reduces population growth. BTI reduces larval survival. Airflow reduces landing success. Harborage removal reduces survival time. And attract-entrap systems reduce contact rates. Each layer targets a different stage of the mosquito's life or behavior. This is why the system works better than any single product. Because mosquitoes are not defeated by intensity, they're defeated by disruption across multiple points in their life cycle. Now, there's another important behavioral factor most people underestimate: external population pressure. Even if your yard is perfectly controlled, mosquitoes can still come from nearby areas. They can travel significant distances depending on species and environmental conditions. That means your yard is always part of a larger ecosystem. This is why isolated treatment often feels temporary. You fix your space, but surrounding areas keep reintroducing pressure. The solution is not perfection, it's reduction. If your yard is less attractive, less hospitable, and less productive than surrounding areas, mosquito activity naturally shifts away from it. You don't need to eliminate every mosquito in the region. You just need to make your property the least favorable option nearby. That shift alone dramatically reduces biting frequency. At this point in the system, something interesting happens psychologically as well. People start noticing that mosquitoes are no longer a constant background problem. Instead, they become occasional events. A few here and there instead of continuous irritation. And that changes how the space feels entirely. Backyards become usable again in the evening. Outdoor time stops being something you endure and becomes something you enjoy again. And that's really the end goal of all of this. Not perfection, but freedom from constant discomfort. Now, there's one final reinforcement step that ties everything together, and it's often overlooked because it seems too simple to matter. Consistency. Most mosquito control efforts fail not because the methods are wrong, but because they are only done once. A single cleanup doesn't matter if water returns a week later. A single treatment doesn't matter if breeding sites are still active. A single adjustment doesn't matter if it isn't maintained. Mosquito control is not a one-time project. It's a repeating cycle of small actions that prevent reestablishment. Once-a-week checks, seasonal adjustments, quick corrections after rain. This maintenance layer is what keeps the system stable long-term. Without it, even the best setup gradually loses effectiveness. With it, the system stays self-correcting. At this stage, the overall structure becomes clear. You're not fighting mosquitoes anymore. You're managing conditions that prevent them from thriving. And that distinction is what makes everything sustainable. Now that the system is fully working at the environmental level, this is where most people finally notice something interesting. Mosquitoes don't disappear completely, but their behavior changes so much that the problem stops feeling overwhelming. Instead of constant biting, buzzing, and irritation, you start seeing isolated incidents. A few mosquitoes at dusk instead of a full invasion. And that shift is exactly what the system is designed to create. But to stabilize those results, there's another layer that often gets ignored: managing the small mistakes that quietly rebuild mosquito populations over time. Because in real life, mosquito control fails in very predictable ways. Not because the methods stop working, but because people slowly stop maintaining them. A bucket gets left outside after a rain. A clogged gutter is forgotten for a few weeks. A plant tray fills up and no one notices. These small oversights are enough to restart the cycle. That's why long-term control is less about intensity and more about habit. A weekly routine becomes the backbone of the system. Not a full project every time, just a quick scan. 10 minutes walking the yard. Checking obvious water points. Flipping containers. Clearing anything newly collected. This simple repetition prevents buildup from restarting. And over time, that consistency becomes more powerful than any single treatment. Now, there's another layer that strengthens the system even further, understanding how mosquito pressure moves between properties. Mosquitoes don't respect fences, property lines, or ownership boundaries. If conditions are good nearby, they will move freely between yards. This is why two neighbors can have completely different experiences even in the same environment. One yard can feel unbearable, while the next feels manageable. The difference is not location. It's micro-conditions. If one property has standing water and dense vegetation, it becomes a production zone. If the next property removes those conditions, it becomes a low-priority feeding area. Mosquitoes naturally concentrate where survival is easiest. This means your goal is not isolation, it's competitiveness. You want your yard to be less attractive than surrounding environments. Once that happens, mosquito activity naturally shifts away from your space. Now, another important concept comes into play: residual adult pressure. Even after breeding sites are removed and larvae are controlled, adult mosquitoes don't vanish instantly. They remain active for a short period depending on lifespan and conditions. During this transition phase, people often make a mistake. They assume the system is not working yet. But in reality, they are just seeing the tail end of the old population. This is where patience becomes part of the process. Because mosquito populations don't collapse instantly. They decline over 1 or 2 life cycles. That's why most effective systems show noticeable improvement within days, but full stabilization takes a couple of weeks. Now let's talk about something subtle but powerful: airflow management. Earlier, airflow was introduced as a way to disrupt mosquito movement using fans. But airflow also plays a larger role in yard conditions overall. Still, air creates stability zones where mosquitoes can rest easily. Moving air creates instability, making navigation and landing harder. Even natural wind patterns matter. Open yards with good cross-ventilation naturally experience lower mosquito density than enclosed, stagnant spaces. This is why structural openness is just as important as cleaning. Cutting back dense vegetation doesn't just remove hiding spots, it changes air movement. It creates a less stable environment for mosquitoes to operate in, and over time, that makes the space fundamentally less usable for them. Another overlooked factor is moisture retention in landscaping. Many yards unintentionally create humidity traps, mulch layers that stay wet, dense ground cover that blocks evaporation, shaded soil that never fully dries. These microhumid zones act as resting comfort areas. Reducing excessive moisture retention helps dry out these zones faster, making them less suitable for mosquito resting behavior. Now, at this stage of the system, something important becomes clear. You're no longer reacting to mosquitoes. You're shaping the environment they depend on. That shift is what makes the system sustainable. But there is still one more reinforcing layer that ties everything together: edge defense. Most mosquito activity concentrates around transitional zones, areas between shade and sunlight, vegetation and open space, structure and yard. These edges act like highways for mosquito movement, so managing them properly reduces movement efficiency. Keeping edges clean, open, and less sheltered forces mosquitoes into less optimal paths, and that reduces how often they encounter people directly. Now, there's also a behavioral shift that happens for homeowners once this system is in place. At first, they focus heavily on elimination, try to remove every possible mosquito. But over time, the mindset shifts. Instead of chasing perfection, they start focusing on stability. They begin to understand that a completely mosquito-free environment is unrealistic, but a low-pressure environment is absolutely achievable. And that difference is important, because once expectations align with biology, frustration disappears. Now, the system becomes something else entirely. It becomes maintenance instead of struggle. At this point, most of the heavy lifting is already done. Breeding sites are controlled. Larval development is interrupted. Adult survival is reduced. Behavioral exposure is minimized. What remains is consistency. And consistency is what keeps the system stable long-term. Without it, even a well-designed yard gradually regresses. With it, mosquito pressure stays consistently low. Now, there's one final psychological element worth mentioning. People often underestimate how quickly perception changes. When mosquito activity drops, outdoor spaces suddenly feel larger, calmer, and more usable. Evening routines shift. People sit outside longer. Kids spend more time in the yard. The space stops feeling like something to avoid. That change is not just physical. It's behavioral and emotional. And it's one of the strongest indicators that the system is working correctly. Because the goal was never just insect reduction. It was restoring usability of the space. And once that happens, the system has achieved its purpose. At this point, everything comes together into a complete system. Not a collection of tricks, but a layered approach that targets mosquitoes at every stage of their life cycle and behavior. And when you step back, the logic becomes very simple. You're no longer fighting mosquitoes directly. You are removing the conditions that allow them to exist in large numbers. That shift is what makes the entire approach sustainable. Because if you think about traditional mosquito control, most of it is reactive. You see mosquitoes, you spray. You get bitten, you buy a trap. You hear buzzing, you light candles or plug-in devices. But all of those responses happen after the problem already exists. This system works differently. It focuses on prevention at the source. And once you understand that, every step fits into place. Water control stops new generations from forming. Biological treatment eliminates larvae before they mature. Environmental changes reduce survival and resting comfort. Air movement disrupts flight and host detection. And behavioral habits maintain long-term stability. Each layer reinforces the others. Now, when all of this is working together, something important happens over time. The mosquito population doesn't just reduce. It loses momentum completely. Because mosquitoes rely on rapid reproduction cycles to maintain pressure. If that cycle is constantly interrupted, the population cannot sustain itself. So instead of spikes after rain or seasonal surges, you start seeing a flattened curve of activity. Low, inconsistent, and manageable. Now let's talk about something most people underestimate. Time scale. Mosquito control is not instant. Even when done correctly, you're still working against biological cycles that were already in motion before you intervened. Eggs may already be present in containers. Larvae may already be developing in hidden water. Adults may already be active in nearby areas. So even after you apply every step correctly, there is a transition period, usually around 1 to 2 weeks. During this time, people often assume the system is failing. But in reality, it's just clearing out what already existed. Once that phase passes, the improvement becomes much more obvious. And that's where confidence in the system starts to build. Because results stop being random. They become predictable. Now, there's another important long-term factor, external pressure. No property exists in isolation. If surrounding yards, drainage areas, or natural zones have active mosquito breeding, there will always be some level of migration. But here's the key insight. You don't need to eliminate every mosquito in the region. You only need to reduce your property's attractiveness relative to everything around it. Mosquitoes behave opportunistically. They go where survival is easiest. So if your yard has fewer breeding sites, less shelter, and more disruption, it becomes a lower priority zone. Over time, that shifts their activity patterns naturally. This is why isolated efforts often feel temporary, and why system-based approaches feel stable. Because they change the ranking of your yard in the mosquito's decision process. Now let's revisit the core idea that drives everything. Adults are the symptom. Water is the cause. Once that is fully understood, the entire problem simplifies. You stop trying to eliminate visible mosquitoes, and instead focus on breaking the reproduction cycle. That's where true control comes from. Everything else is just support. Even tools, like traps or fans, are not primary solutions. They are reinforcement layers. Helpful, but not foundational. The foundation is always source elimination and larval interruption. Now, one of the most important habits that keeps everything stable long-term is routine inspection. Not intense work, just consistency. A short weekly walk through the yard, looking for new water accumulation, checking known problem spots, correcting issues early before they develop into breeding sites. This habit is what prevents regression. Because mosquitoes don't require perfect conditions, they only need temporary opportunities. A single forgotten container after rain is enough to restart a cycle. That's why maintenance matters more than intensity. Now, when people apply this system correctly, something interesting happens psychologically. Their relationship with outdoor space changes completely. Before, evenings outside were stressful. Constant awareness of biting, constant interruptions, constant irritation. After implementation, that pressure disappears. And outdoor time becomes normal again. Not because mosquitoes are eliminated entirely, but because they are no longer dominating the experience. And that's the real goal. Now, there's also an economic layer to this. Most people spend money in the wrong direction at first. They invest in repeated sprays, monthly services, electric traps, devices that provide temporary relief. But none of those address the actual source. So costs accumulate without long-term stability. In contrast, a system-based approach requires minimal ongoing expense. Basic materials, occasional biological treatments, simple maintenance tools. But once established, it doesn't require constant reinvestment to remain effective. That difference becomes significant over time. Now, stepping back from the technical side, there's a broader lesson in all of this. Most household pest problems follow the same pattern. People focus on the visible issue, but the real cause is often hidden in environmental conditions. Moisture, shelter, food sources, reproduction cycles. Once you shift from reacting to managing conditions, problems become easier to control. Not just mosquitoes, but many other pests behave the same way. Now, bringing it back to this system specifically, everything works because it targets multiple weak points in the mosquito life cycle simultaneously. They're not strong organisms individually. Their strength comes from numbers and rapid reproduction. If you disrupt that cycle at multiple stages, the population collapses naturally. No need for extreme measures. No need for constant chemical exposure. Just consistent environmental control. And once that system is in place, the yard stabilizes into a low-pressure zone where mosquito activity is minimal and predictable. That is the end result. Not perfection, but control. Now, if there's one final takeaway from everything in this system, it's this: mosquito control is not about killing mosquitoes faster. It's about making your environment incapable of sustaining them in large numbers. Once you achieve that, everything else becomes maintenance, not battle. And that's the point where outdoor living becomes normal again. Simple evenings, quiet air, no constant irritation, just usable space. And that is what this entire system is designed to restore.